يؤثرون على أنفسهم ولو كان بهم خصاصة ومن يوق شح نفسه فأولئك والذين تبوأوا الدار والإيمان من قبلهم يحبون من هاجر إليهم ولا يجدون في صدورهم حاجة مما
wondering if somebody needs to stand in this. Push it.
Okay, so if I make it.
Yeah. It's just, it's these, I just need to grab a stick or something that
والذين جاءوا من بعدهم يقولون ربنا اغفر لنا ولإخواننا سبقونا بالإيمان ربنا اغفر لنا ولإخواننا الذين سبقونا بالإيمان ولا تجعل في قلوبنا والذين جاءوا من بعدهم يقولون ربنا اغفر لنا ولإخواننا الذين سبقونا بالإيمان ولا تجعل في قلوبنا غلا للذين آمنوا ربنا إنك رؤوف رحيم ألم تر إلى الذين نافقوا يقولون لإخوانهم الذين كفروا
You probably do that. That's like the angel.
Brother, hello? Hello? Please, you taking my brother go? No, you say that one, please. No, you say that one, please. Okay? You taking my brother go the manager. The manager.
Then do you want to play around with me?
Manager, please use the move the
That one's correct.
projector.
I'm just see that toggle.
This is a control remote.
Okay, I was trying
Okay,
to see.
please. Please.
They're all
I know. This is a control remote.
It doesn't work. So look, the image you can change all the settings. It doesn't work.
Where's move? Okay, hold on. Hold on.
Third with that.
That's it. Please, you come here. You come here one Banco Hall. Please, you move the projector or what happened? Okay, brother. Please come here.
Spoke to Brother Nelson. He doesn't know the story. I
Please
already
come
spoke
here
to
right
him.
now. Right now,
He
come
was
here.
here. I spoke to him. I told him he doesn't know. Okay? It's fine. It's fine. So thank you for calling him. But I already spoke to him.
That's running.
He doesn't
Come
know.
in here. Maybe move the on the room. Maybe I don't know.
I was just. I'm not gonna break it.
Okay, you move already. You move.
I'll put it back.
Alright. Okay. Thank you very much. Nasser, kid, come here.
Right is that right wing populism.
Still the same. The color?
No,
Would you?
well, the thing is, if I made it worse, I could probably make it better. But it's in the other direction. That's.
The thing is, it's being cut off there from.
So which way did I move it last time? Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, here's the remote.
Oh, it's like everyone's coming to tell me there's remote. Yeah, it's still not working with the remote.
Okay, now it's actually made it worse, so make the other way. You see, it's in Santa Clara, on the hub of the Silicon Valley. We should not need a broom to fix advanced technology, but because it's no, because it's a Muslim
What
thing.
happened?
It's
You have a remote. You have a remote in
I know, but the shaitan is saying that this does not work.
No, don't do it this way. Go this way.
No, this is working.
Please, please,
The remote is working. It's just that it's cut off.
No, put it here. Like that one is correct.
We can
Okay,
change it.
now good.
No, it's not good. Cut off.
Why?
It's cut off the writing.
How you did it then? You can just move it that way.
This
Please go. Leave it.
Try that
خليني اجيب السجع. What is makers?
Yeah, okay, it's worked. It's worked.
Worked?
Yeah. But now enlarge it.
How? خلاص.
look, it's still small. The other side.
Okay, now good.
The same size? No, حبيبي, see same size. الله يخليك. Same size. خلاص. هالمشكلة بيلعبوا
بالتكنولوجيا بس
طيب أعطي الكرسي يا شيخ رايت حكى شهادة الجلسات علام ولا علام
It's still cutting off from the other side. Somewhere it's cut off.
You know what, presentation they're going to be having?
It's
That's
the,
it.
the rise of right-wing populism and the Muslim
What's
Islam.
right-wing populism?
It's Trump and his haircut.
I love it.
Huh?
So you guys are against Trump?
Yeah,
How can we be against such a beautiful Cheeto-looking man?
that's true. I'm sorry. But somebody has to do it.
So is this going to be a question and answer, or is it going to be like what you
Be a
do?
lecture and then question and answer.
What time do you commence?
We're right after the salah. We don't want to interrupt the salah. Yeah.
All 21 rakats?
No, 8. Yeah.
Because they do go to 21, right?
Yeah.
The leader in the league. Nations, hopefully.
But you can't blame me today for the Warriors losing.
Yeah. Your team, is it?
Huh?
Is it your team?
Well, they didn't ask me to play, that's why I haven't.
What we need is warriors from amongst the Muslims
Yes.
in today's day and age. One academic and the other intellectual.
Yes.
We also need them on the fields.
Sure.
I'm very curious to hear you speak today. I'd like to ask you a few questions after that.
Okay. Few questions or one, you might get the chance for one.
You're very kind. By the way, let me introduce myself. You and I are connected on LinkedIn as well.
Okay.
I know Mr. Youssef. I've met with him before.
Oh, okay.
He was ASO.
Okay, it's a pleasure. Pleasure.
Honors all mine. I'm very curious. There's a lot of agony and distrust amongst the Muslim world. Neo-fascists,
Oh, yes.
Judeo-Christian lines, especially in terms of what's going on in
China.
China, the Uyghurs. But really, I don't see that we have one response.
We do, but it's against the Muslim countries.
We academically, intellectually, we have spoken out that we need a cohesive response against the governments. See, it won't just be he was being really leading religion. Anyways, we'll speak.
Where are you based?
Very nice meeting you.
How are you?
Working boy. And you work with other
Hey, yeah, like putting so many months.
It's remarkable that you're one of the founders.
software.
بخير؟ عدة أيام.
I still have one question.
We will see. We're gonna
Very well.
auction
One
the
for Mr. Hamza Yusuf as well.
we're gonna auction the
One for Hamza.
إن شاء الله. إن شاء الله. We're gonna auction. We're gonna put it on eBay, and people will bid on it. Since this is a tech event. إن شاء الله. أحلام. I saw that. I never put faces, but names were horrible. Alhamdulillah, I was when you were
We're about to start the talk. On theology at Zaytun College. He's also a professor at UC Berkeley, and my teacher back then. He's probably one of, if not the expert in our community about these topics. So, brothers in the back, if you could please take a seat or step outside to continue your conversation. We're about to get started.
جزاك الله خير. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Really good to be back here at MCA. Usually I'm here for Friday khutbahs, so today I'm having just a lecture and hopefully we'll have a discussion thereafter. Now, the topic that I wanted to cover today is the rise of populism, right-wing populism in particular, and then how we as Muslims, as well as our allies, how to respond to it, but from an Islamic perspective, if we could say so. And I will go through my presentation, and then later on we'll have some question and answer, and I'll promise that it will be before Suhoor. Inshallah. Now, many of you possibly have watched the Soccer World Cup. For those who are tuned to the Soccer World Cup, and the question about who's French in relation to the makeup of the team, what makes a person French, and how did this happen? How did we get a perspective that you have a picture of a team that supposedly represents France, but then you have a rising tide of right-wing in France who says that to be French, you have to be French to the source, which basically you have to be white, and as such you don't represent the true Frenchness, if there is such a term. And in essence, the Muslims in particular have been the focus of French right-wing and the attack on Muslims. Now some have actually tweeted that France had the best African team in the World Cup. And then as the French team won the World Cup, also some tweeted, congrats to Africa for winning the World Cup. Because again, the French team is predominantly 60% of the membership of the team is made of African players. And I'll get into how this happened in relation to the current debate about immigration and the focusing on the targeting of immigrants. Now, this is also another few images of Ozil from the German team. He said, I'm a German when we win, but I am an immigrant when we lose. And the German team lost, if you remember, from the first round. And Ozil was actually blamed, or at least the attack on him, and then he actually resigned from, quit the German national team and wrote a very long letter explaining how he faced intense Islamophobic attacks on him. And then later on, because he took a picture with Erdogan, that became the focus of attention, while other players have taken pictures with right-wing politicians, right-wing populist politicians, including pictures with individuals that would be almost to the pale that you don't want to be affiliated with, but there is no attack or critique. Also, Benzema was left from the French team. He said, when I score, I'm French. When I don't, I'm an Arab. And in another translation, another coverage, he says, when I don't score, I'm a dirty Arab. So here, the perspective of moving between Arabness and Frenchness, what makes a person French or Arab, is subject to these racial criteria that have become frequent in right-wing populism. Also, Lukaku, he says, when things were going well, I was the Belgian striker. When they weren't, I was the striker of Congolese descent, which means that he is inferior. So for those who follow the European soccer tournaments, one can find often as the players go to the soccer fields, in Italy, for example, African players will be facing with bananas being thrown at them while they're playing. Again, this is aspect of the rising tide of populism that has a long-standing racial feature to it. Now, moving to another question, do you love chocolate? Now, I'm not a salesperson for the chocolate company. They did not give me any discount. But many of us possibly would raise our hands. But myself being Palestinian from Nablus, I'll raise my hand and it says, who likes knafa? So again, but who likes chocolate is an important question. And who has the best chocolate in the world? Right? So we would see Belgian, Canadian, Swiss, German, American, Italian, French, all these names, including possibly here, Sea Candies, people say it's one of the best. But this is a question, I'll get to it. Do you like Nutella? Right, where we pay so much money at the counter. It's not good for you in terms of diet, clog your artery, but you can consult your physician. But to think of Nutella and whether we like that Nutella chocolate or not. Now, if we look at the map of the world on suppliers and where the distributors of Nutella and Nutella factories, and I'm getting to a particular understanding of what is taking place in the world that we're part of today. We are looking at the world of producers and consumers. Most of the countries that are affiliated or identified with having the best chocolate is actually none of the countries have a single cocoa plant. Possibly you have a cocoa plant in one of those reserves and so on, but all of the natural cocoa plants are in the southern hemisphere, while all the chocolate manufactured are in the northern hemisphere. And if you go to some of the boutique chocolate these days, you're actually, a piece of chocolate will cost you $15 or $20. You're going to take a picture next to it. But yet the people who actually have the cocoa plants and the raw material would never enjoy those chocolates. This is a result of a long history of taking resources from the global south. So this is a map of the world based on resources and where these resources are located, and in particular focusing on Africa, which is actually one of the richest continents in terms of natural resources. But it has been made to be impoverished by means of 500 years of continued stealing of resources. And wherever there's conflict that we see in various parts of Africa, actually rather than asking the question of the racial or tribal background, ask which corporation is extracting which natural resources would be the way to actually examine the conflict. So all of these conflicts that are being stoked around natural resources. Now this gets us into the migration, because we have a major crisis of the immigration crisis and the refugee crisis. And if we look at where the relations to Africa, most of the refugees and immigrants that are arriving to Europe, we just leave Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq to the side, most of the refugees and immigrants that are coming to Europe are coming from the ex-colonies, meaning these are colonial subjects as a result of the disruption of the post-colonial state system that has continued to open the door for immigration and refugees. You could say that this started almost 300 years plus years. Some would actually argue even much earlier, as the colonization opened the door to ravage the economies and the political systems in the global south, the end result is this immigration and refugees. There's another aspect to this, which is the brain drain. Many of us in this room possibly are part of the brain drain for our home countries. The opening of this door that begins with the colonization have not stopped and continue to actually create structural disruption of countries that we all belong to. So immigration and refugees that are right now as a major crisis, both in Europe and the United States, it's a crisis that has been structurally created and it has many different elements to it. Now, I'm mentioning this because the populist politician points out that the problem is these refugees and immigrants that are coming to take our country. So it's always projecting the problem on someone else without actually looking at the problem from a longer historical period and also examining that this structural period and the history was actually put in place almost 250 to 300 years, and the result of it is the continued underdevelopment that we see in the global south. Now this is another picture of the Syrian refugees and the arrival of Syrian refugees into various parts of Europe, but one has to make it clear. The largest number of Syrian refugees are hosted by Muslim countries. The largest country that hosts Syrian refugees is Turkey, with 3.5 million refugees. Next is Lebanon, with about 1 million plus, and then third is Jordan. In particular, the Syrian refugees, the European Union promised to offer resources and support, but actually they were not forthcoming in providing resources and support for the refugees. In here, they want to intervene in countries, but they don't want the consequences of the intervention. So again, major powers want to intervene in the politics and in the lives of people, whether it's Syria, prior to that Iraq, we know the situation in Libya, Somalia, and then Afghanistan. That pipeline is directly related to the interventions that took place, and as such, blaming the refugee problem on the refugee, him or herself, without taking responsibility for how the refugee became a refugee in the first place. In addition, you find, particularly in France, right outside the Eurotunnel, you had actually a camp that had about 7,000 refugees. It's called the Jungle, ironically enough. And these refugees are attempting to cross under the Eurotunnel to make it to the UK. Some of these refugees actually spent 6 months to a year, sometimes a year and a half, coming out, whether it's from Africa, some from Afghanistan, some from the Central African Republic, some from Myanmar. It'll take them sometimes a year and a half to make it because they go through land routes, across the Mediterranean, and so on. Now, one aspect to understand that the European Union have passed a legislation that an individual refugee, upon arriving to their first country, they have to be fingerprinted and registered there. And then they are not allowed to leave, and there would be the responsibility of that country that is a country of first arrival. So whether it be Italy, Spain, Malta, Greece, and this was as a way to prevent the refugees from moving to northern countries or western countries in Europe. Now this resulted in individuals who are caught is actually they work on erasing their fingerprints. So as they get fingerprinted, they actually go and scratch, literally their fingerprints gets to be bled and disrupted in such a way that they move to the second country. If their fingerprints are taken, they will not actually be clear or identifiable. So this is something I wrote about, that this is the erasure of the human because that is the first distinctive aspect of a human being, is their fingerprint, right? And it's again relative to the Quranic text that God will reconstitute the human, including their fingerprint, right? So again, this is part of a structural aspect that we're seeing in Europe, and on a daily basis, individuals, right by the tunnel, attempt to jump on trucks in order to cross, and on a daily basis, you have deaths that occur in this process. But thinking longer historical lens, actually European immigration and refugees has been one of the largest aspects of the movements of a human being. Those populist politicians that saying to people go back home, I think the Native Americans should be asking, you should go back home before you actually pose that question. Or the person who went into the New Zealand mosques, shooting his way through it, saying that they're taking our country back, not in a moment as an Australian, that Australia did not become Australia without completely eliminating the indigenous population and the aborigines in that country. So if we think of the history of massive migration from Europe, especially in the United States, as we think of the country that we are in today, resulting in the elimination and the genocide of the native population. So we have to really counter or contextualize this populist rhetoric that takes place, that begins to constantly blame and label those individuals that are coming as a result of their intervention, or the US intervention, European intervention, blaming them for what is taking place. Now this is a very important map to look at. This is the map of the world, and all the green areas are the areas that were subject to European colonial control. And when we think of colonization, often people think it's way back in history. Most of the countries that were colonized did not gain their independence until after the Second World War, with the majority of them actually in the 1960s. So literally, most of us that are here, at least of older age, we were born at a time where colonization was still the reality in much of the world. So we're not talking about a long distance. This is important because often both Muslims as well as other colonized populations say, why can't you just, get over it? This is at a time where individuals who possibly advocate for continued intervention in other countries are saying we're doing it in order to avenge or revenge a particular occurrence of the distant past. And I think 9/11 has been one of those elements that are being used as a framing for why we need to intervene. We need to intervene in order to prevent the next occurrence without actually failing to recognize the long history of colonization. So if you were born in the 1950s, or if you looked at the world in 1914, you most likely would have been a subject of the British as a colonial subject, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the German, the Italian. So this is the reality that we are looking at in terms of world history. Now, what we need is reframing our worldview. And I say instead of looking for the race, ethnic identity of the immigrants and refugees, we should be examining the race for war, profits, natural resources, and what corporations and countries that are involved. Because often it's the focus, for example, again for us, specifically in Muslim context, every time there is a conflict, we bring in the Shia Sunni. Right? So every time that you actually come to the press, they say, why the Sunni and Shia hate each other, right? That's the framing. In essence, this is a way for us not to think of what are the causes for war, what are the stimuli. And again, if you look, mostly it's about oil, natural resources, waterways, access, movement of trade. But as long as you put the label on it that it's a Sunni-Shia conflict, you stop thinking. And then you get people to possibly go and get polemical on their Sunni-Shia differences. And in doing so, you basically obfuscate the causalities of war. In other regions, it would be the tribal conflict. So tribe A hates tribe B, and that is the reason for the conflict. But they never tell you that tribe A and tribe B are sitting on top of a major oil field, and Chevron and Shell would like that oil field, so stoking the conflict and making possible for this conflict to occur is an easy way to get access to the resources. In general, and this is, I think, is a big aspect that we need to focus, that both Sunni and Shia, in terms of the Muslim world, they're selling oil and natural gas, buying weapons, killing each other, and then saying Allahu Akbar. Right? Again, this is just what is stoking the conflicts in order to maintain the flow of natural resources and continue the process of the development. But what we need to understand is what is the problem of populism and how to frame it. Populism is built on pain and suffering, on real pain and suffering, that there is pain and suffering in various parts. So for example, if you are a part of industrial labor force in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and all of a sudden you lost your job, your steel plant was closed, the jobs have been shifted first to the maquiladoras on the Mexican border, then from Mexico they were shifted to China, then from China some other places. You're actually saying that your livelihood have completely been disrupted. Your normal sense of well-being is no longer possible. You used to be able to have one job, work in a factory, possibly retire, have your home, your kids will go to school, and there is a normal sense of life as you know it. But that has been disrupted for a variety of reasons. So populism uses the existing economic pains, economic suffering, social transformation as a way to posit that they are the solution, and usually they try to identify a target for their strategy. So what populism is a constructed binary worldview. It's us and them. Us are the victims of them who are coming to take what belongs to us. It packages real people's pain and suffering into blame and scapegoating. So again, Trump is a master at it. The reason that you are not having your part or your opportunity is because the immigrants are coming. The Mexican immigrants are coming, and then the second is the Muslims who are also trying to disrupt our lifestyle, our society that we have an imagined society on the past. So it actually packages this political figure of a simple solution to complex and systematic problems. So again, it's an easy fix that Trump in here, Marine Le Pen in France, Nigel Farage in the UK, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. So they all are modeling the same type of strategy, packaging the people's pain and suffering and then using scapegoating as a way. Now, it's also the concept of what a people is. So white supremacy, the marker for the people or the national community. So when they say the people in here is not everyone. So when they say we the people in terms of their conceptualization, it does not include everyone. Or Marine Le Pen in France, the French, when she say about the French being French to the source, it does not include the Moroccans, it does not include Algerians, it does not include Senegalese, it does not include those who have been in France for 150 years or more, working and continuing to be on the margin of society. So white supremacy becomes the marker for who belongs and who doesn't belong into the society. Second, militarism is posited as the road to rescue the people. So again, if you look at the right-wing populism, it's almost positive that we need is to build our military, to be strong. So at a time where actually you need to have far more distribution of resources to attend to the needs, you need more healthcare, you need to invest in education, you need to retool and retrain a population that lost its jobs. You actually say what we need is to increase our military expenditure, militarism, and with it you increase intervention. So that becomes an easy way to actually package strength or a perception of strength by means of militarism and economic well-being for whites while blaming the other for pain and suffering. So again, it's always, we need to look at the heartland of America, and the heartland is conceptualized around the white aspect of society, and in here without problematizing white as a category, but in here white as an ideology. When we need to make that distinction, in here it's an ideology rather than a skin tone. It creates a mental map, or a mental map to view the world, a kind of mental map to individuals analyze and comprehend political reality, even though political reality might be in contradiction. So that's why if you follow Trump, he has more lies than can actually be recorded, but actually because he fits into that worldview and that reality, it becomes actually very systematic to be accepted and analyzed in that way. They are causing you pain and suffering. So if you follow Trump's speech, every time he mentions or he uses them, usually right these days he's focusing on the Mexican immigrants. Today he slapped 5% or is going to slap 5% tariffs on Mexico in order for Mexico to deal with the problem of the immigrants that are crossing the border. This is without actually looking at what are the causes for both Mexicans and Latin American immigration. If you want to understand it, you have to look at the Monroe Doctrine. This is a 250-year U.S. intervention in Latin Americans' affairs through the years of intervention, through the years of coups, through the years of low-intensity warfare, as well as overall warfare in many parts of Latin America, the disruption of the Mexican economy through NAFTA. But it's much easier to say they are taking your jobs. They're the ones who are causing the crime that are taking place. Just if you think about the opioid addiction that is taking place, was that the Mexicans that are causing this, or some corporate elite with nice suits and ties sitting in corporate offices? But it's much easier to say that the problem belongs to or originates in someone else. It's a binary worldview, friend and foe, and begins to actually uses this as a way to stoke bigotry, racism, and discrimination against the target group. It also posits that the purity of one against the corruption and immorality of the elite. So you see that the populists posit that there's an elite in there. So again, whether we use the term deep state that is being used, or the Hollywood elite, all those are buzzwords, in essence, to say that you are the pure ones, the one with me, the populist figure, who's often, raised up and put as a way to project him or herself as the rescuer, while those who are immoral, those who represent the elite, are the ones that are undermining our society. So there is a logic to the rhetoric, there is a logic and to the messaging that is taking place. It's not haphazard. Actually, there is a structural and a purpose behind it. There's also this imagined community, right? America's heartland, those who are included in the imagined national identity. So whenever I say, well, the heartland of America, or outside of the Bible Belt, or the Bible Belt, this is essentially saying that these are the people that have meaning, while the rest don't have meaning or don't belong to this national identity. The heartland was the place in which, in the populist imagination, a virtuous and unified population exists. So again, this notion of the heartland is used often as a way to say who belongs and who doesn't belong. So the conception of a national identity in the United States around the heartland, you will be challenged to actually think of a singular type of identity. America is almost 50 countries that are made into one country. And there's a diversity of identities in there. The identity of Harlem or Brooklyn is different than the identity in Boston, different than in Florida, different than in Texas or New Mexico or Las Vegas or California or Seattle, Washington. But the attempt in here to say that there is something that is a core, that is pure, that is being challenged by the others. African Americans, Latinos, minorities disrupt the imagined oneness of the community. So again, because you don't fit into the categorization of who this conceptualization of this national community. So again, the concept of the people are neither real nor are all-inclusive. So when we say the people, we have a diversity of people that we need to often conceptualize and think. But for the populists, when they deploy the people, it's often in their imagined notion of who belongs and who doesn't belong. Now, just to think about when the framing of the U.S. Constitution, we the people did not include all the people that is inclusive of we the people. We the people did not include African Americans, did not include Native Americans, did not include Chinese, did not include whites who did not own property, did not include women. It's always been a struggle to actually bring the people into the we the people. And it's been a struggle to actually continue to expand and make at least the principle that was enunciated with the framing of the Constitution to live to the conceptualization of we the people, and we continue to struggle today. Now this gets me into the segue into when we think of the KKK's history is America's history, is not outside of America's history. And it was not only these small groups that were part of the KKK. This is Birth of a Nation. It was a major, one of the first major long movies that actually was previewed at the White House during the early part of the 20th century. Not only that, but they actually marched up and down Pennsylvania Avenue in D.C. Now, America's first. Does that sound familiar today? Right? America first is not only an aspect that just came out of the discussion of Trump, but actually have a long history during the early part of the 20th century, if not before. The rise of the KKK actually emerges after the Civil War and in the period of Reconstruction, specifically as a way to contest and challenge the empowerment of African Americans at the time and minorities. As the Civil War concluded, access to land resources was part of the transformation that was being posited. So we moved from slavery into Jim Crow laws that prevented the real empowerment of African Americans. And from Jim Crow, we moved into the Civil Rights Movement, and there's the challenges that we speak today in relation to the changes that are being conceptualized. So these were common rallies that would take place in the United States. And if this does not sound or look familiar to Charlottesville and the marchers that went and bought what you call tiki torches from Costco in order to march to say that we want to take our country back, and also trying to stoke again anti-Semitism as well, that Jews will not replace us. So the whole conceptualization of the replacement idea, which is prevalent in Europe as well. This is again, we can't speak of history in the past. It's actually with us today. They might not be wearing these white robes and hoods, but actually you don't need a hood to continue to exhibit and promote the same type of ideology. Now, lynching in America has a long history. The height of lynching in America occurs again after the Civil War. From 1876 to 1950, approximately 4,000 African Americans were lynched in 12 southern states. Approximately 2 African Americans were lynched per week. I argue that lynching was a political terrorizing campaign to terrorize African Americans out of their property, their land, and their political and economic empowerment. These are some of the states, and each dot on this map represents one lynching that takes place, and in some places you see how intense the terrorization campaign of African Americans. In some counties, they completely chased some African Americans out of those regions. In terms of the contemporary period, one can argue, and I make that argument, that the prison industrial complex today is a strategy to counter the empowerment of African Americans and Latinos post the civil rights movement. So a prison becomes another way to remove people out of political empowerment, since many of those who end up being convicted as felons, with 92% of those who face the criminal justice system get a plea bargain. So you actually have a structural disenfranchisement as a part of the justice legal system that we have at this point. Now, there is attempts to recognition and apology for the lynching incidents, and that's still a part of the campaign for the Equal Justice Initiative to try to reconcile, because we have not yet really began to deal with the traumas and the systematic oppression of African Americans. We have not yet had an apology, let alone begin to deal actually with trans-historical traumas that are part and parcel of the experience. Now, right-wing populism is really emerges in the following trajectory. There's global changes occurring, and with that, individuals, rather than deal with the global changes, populism is an easy way to package it in a simplistic way. It's setting in resentment politics, and we're experiencing resentment politics in the United States right now. Immigration and xenophobia, social fragmentation, militarism and violence, and mass media. So these are the drivers of populism, and one can even give a lecture on each one of these categories by itself. But in terms of understanding how populism is there, one has to dissect what is taking place in order to understand. But a populist is not interested in deep conversation and meaningful conversation and exploration of causalities and how to deal with it. They just want to say, us are pure, and these are the people that are causing our pain and suffering. And usually, 99% of the time, those who are causing our pain and suffering are usually either brown and black people. So it actually conveniently fit into a trajectory that recenters whiteness and white supremacy as the way to view the world and what needs to be done. Now, populism is driven by media, for sure. It's not the cause, it's driven by the media. So I think people need to distinguish between the media as a driver versus the media as the cause. Now, why the media is a driver, the role of the media is driven by sensationalism and scandals, right? So again, you could test it in there. If two Muslims are hugging, it's not a story, right? So if we say that, come and cover Friday prayer, 5,000 Muslims are going to end the prayer by hugging one another, no TV will show up. But I bet you if you say there are going to be Muslims punching each other, all right, the media will be there, and they're going to ask, are they Sunni and Shia? Right? So it begins that is sensationalism in press and media. If it bleeds, it leads. Meaning that's how the media is shaped. The Western media is massive corporate entities. We need to emphasize this. Over 90% of the media that we consume is corporate media. It's not independent. Even what you call investigative journalism is no longer being taken. That's why you have most of these major news outlets, they no longer do really investigative pieces. Just if you watch any of the major networks, it's one anchorman or anchorwoman, and then they have 4 or 5 talking heads. They don't have to go investigate, they don't have to do deep research, you don't have to spend 2 or 3 weeks at the field in order to come up with the story, you don't have to pursue sources. It's like gossip. He said, she said, he said, she said, no, they said, she said, and you run for 24/7, and then you have advertisement in there. So that's, again, it's one of the cheapest way to run, and you sensationalize every story, right? And that becomes one of the best way to actually maximize return. And you could add on the social dimension of it, the whole reality TV, right? Where reality TV these days, who is the person with the most likes and shares, who has the largest Twitter following or Instagram following, becomes that the person we think has the greatest impact on society. Also pushing anti-government sentiments in relation to the society. Politics and policy are theaters of entertainment, so you no longer actually think in gave me the opportunity to drink some water.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Inshallah. So again, politics and policy are theaters for entertainment. So really news pieces are entertainment rather than a full news analysis. And we could see it even at the national level. It used to be a longer news hour, longer news coverage and so on with less commercials. Now it's more commercial even than content. Real experts are replaced with slick opinion makers or influencers, like the term influencers and talking heads. And you ask the person, what's your expertise? I remember one time, one person that I was on a TV program with, and he's expert in democratization in the Arab world. Not in one country, in the Arab world. There's 22 Arab countries. Right? He's the expert. His expertise was that he spent 6 months in the green zone in Iraq. Right? I said under that criteria, the best way is actually to take pilots because they spend more time in the countries than anyone else, and they spend sometimes in the Hilton hotel with the people, and most likely they go and eat the cuisine of the local area. So this person now is expert in democratization in the Arab world. So the audacity actually to frame yourself in this way, and it becomes about marketing and the public relations company that manages your portfolio in there. And social media becomes the landscape of populism. So it actually comes from social media and then bleeds into the mainstream. Now, ideological driving forces for populism, Huntington thesis, the clash of civilization, has been an important part of this ideological landscape. And then he followed it by another book, Who Are We? Now, in the Clash of Civilization, for those who read or engaged, he posits that the Chinese and the Islamic civilization constitute the threat to Western civilization. And again, the Clash of Civilization really uses cultural racism as a framing to try to delineate the threat to Western civilization. And cultural racism is the signpost for biological racism. So those who, by the Second World War, were discredited on the notion of biological racism or the superiority of one race, now have found comfort in using cultural racism. So it's your cuisine, your dress, your language, so on, becomes the way to actually slope into the same type of discourse that was present in biological racism. And then who are we? Huntington posited that the Latino population and the Mexican immigrants in particular constitute the biggest threat. So you could see that in Huntington thesis, what he is calling for is for us, for the people that he identified, in particular white, Anglo-Saxon settler community, is to call for arms for them to reclaim back the country. So taking our country back, or making America great again, is not
America of everyone. It's America of a conceptualized and imagined past. The same type of rhetoric, racialized rhetoric, we see it in various European countries, whether it's in Switzerland, Germany, and others. In Europe, the more focus is on the Muslim subject. So Muslimness is problematized by the populists because it's in essence making the country or the society impure, and as such you will find the campaigns are centered around the Muslim subject, especially the one at my far left with the Swiss election. You could see that the minarets were transformed into rockets and missiles. And then also the one in the middle, which also was from the Swiss election, you could see the dark sheep. The dark sheep is the Muslims that needs to be kicked out because it does not belong to the national community that is Switzerland. And 2 weeks ago, France passed a law, again, the law that they passed that a Muslim woman with a hijab can't accompany her kid in a school outing. So if you're if you have a school trip, let's say to the Young Museum that's in, let's say, San Francisco, and you're from, let's say, France here in Santa Clara, and you want to accompany your kid, and you wear a hijab in France, you are not allowed to be part of the school trip. This is under preserving what's called the neutrality of state in a matter of religion. So this is just 2 weeks ago that been passed in the French Parliament. Populism and electoral politics, stoking white resentment. Brexit was centered on stoking white resentment, in particular relative to immigrants and refugees, and in particular toward the Muslim part of it. Now, populism also packages Islamophobia and monetizing fear at the ballot box. Now, this is the FBI data. According to the FBI data, from 1980 to 2014, from 1980 to 2014, the percentage of terrorist attacks attributed to Muslims is about 4%. That's it, including 9/11. The FBI actually, its own study says the primary domestic threat in the United States is posed by white nationalists and white supremacists. That's the FBI, not me, not anyone else. It's actually FBI own study. Now, if we go to Europe, it's actually the same thing. In the UK, from 1980 to 2014, their own data and their own statistics about Islamic or terrorism that is attributed to Muslims is about 4%. So in here, again, it's stoking and monetizing fear into votes at the ballot box. And we know that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment intensify during election cycles because right-wing populist politician packages in order to actually drive their base into the ballot box. So populism monetizing economic pain, suffering, and racism at the ballot box, and they have been successful in doing so, and again, our country and other countries as well. Beyond economic sphere of cultural displacement pushed the white working class to Trump. So actually, it's the fear of displacement, this aspect drove many of the voters to Trump and to vote for him in the same way that we find during Brexit, the same type of shift occurred. And now Mercer and Cambridge Analytica has been charged with using Facebook and data analytics in order to drive voters. Robert Mercer invested $2.5 million in the 2016 election, specifically with Islamophobic ads targeted toward white voters in order for them to be stoked into coming out and voting for Trump. So in here the data analytics and the way that it was deployed, and the similar strategy also was in there relative to the Brexit. Mercer and Breitbart, Breitbart was a news outlet that likewise was centered in driving populism, right-wing populism in this sense. So this is the picture. The question which I said is what is our response as Muslims for it? And how do we begin to respond? So one is oppression is not divine.
comes from the prophetic statement, the Hadith Qudsi, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade oppression on himself. I have forbidden injustice for myself, and I have forbidden it among you. So do not oppress one another. So again, meaning from this is that we don't engage in civil society by blaming one another. Rather, we try to find what is the common problem. We don't actually assign group blame. So it's not the Chinese, it's not the immigrants, it's not the Mexican, it's not the Muslims, it's not the whites as a category that is oppressing us. We need to identify where are the sources and what are the causalities in order to be actually sound. And therefore here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with nothing limits him. Allah is saying that I limited oppression on myself, so make sure that you don't engage in oppression among yourselves. Now, how did the Quran define righteousness? And again, this is an important. ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والملائكة والكتاب والنبيين وآتى المال على حبه ذوي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل والسائلين وفي الرقاب وأقام الصلاة وآتى الزكاة والموفون بعهدهم إذا عاهدوا والصابرين في البأساء والضراء وحين البأس أولئك الذين صدقوا وأولئك هم المتقون. So we have a basis of what is it to be righteous in the society. Because what is the purpose to say that we're following a tradition if we're just going to follow whatever people going, they go to the right, we go to the right, we go to the left, jump up, we jump up, right? There is a foundation by which we all have to agree, and this is a Quranic inscripted basis of righteousness. So we actually, whatever righteousness is the standard, we align ourselves with righteousness, no matter who it is coming from, and whatever righteousness is not being adhered to, so we don't affiliate or engage as such. So that's the standard that is measured. It's a Quranic standard that should regulate our both civil society engagement, our engagement in society in general. We also have to distance ourselves from the Pharaonic archetype. That Pharaoh is being presented in the Quran as an archetype for an individual that is an oppressive. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ عَلَى فِي الْأَرْضِ, that behold, Pharaoh exalted himself in the land and divided its people into castes, into their separate groupings. So again, division is one of those aspects of the Pharaonic archetype. One group of them he deemed utterly low. He would slaughter their sons and spare only their women. For behold, he was one of those who spread malevolence on earth, corruption on earth. So again, we need to distance ourselves and identify the Pharaonic archetypal identities, and in particular, populists tend to actually resemble these archetypal identities. So we need to identify, and one can argue that the use of media in the olden days, that Pharaoh used the magicians as a way to try to get people to think that he is on the right path. So one can say that the use of these tools of deception, not to broadly paint the brush on the media, but in essence to try to get individuals to think that he is on the right path by using these instruments. Now what turning the tide for us is in essence to identify that we do understand that there is a metaphorical reality in the world. And the metaphorical reality is that Iblis or Shaitan promises poverty, or think that we don't have the resources or the means. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has defined that the world is a world of plenty, and Allah is a Razzaq. So what we need is to actually think of how we could use our metaphorical understanding in order for us to develop cooperative relations in the society. Our world does not lack resources. It's only the distribution of resources that is lacking. Not to critique the Muslims, in Ramadan we throw more food as Muslims than we actually possibly in the rest of the year. Our consumption increases in Ramadan rather than it actually should be decreased. And if you measure the wastefulness in our own country. Here you could see how much we waste in terms of resources. So what we need is to reframe the problem in the world, because again, if you think of the world system as this, it's spoken that the world is a world of scarcity, and therefore what we need is to fight for the limited resources, and then we get into a Darwinian system. If that's your view, I would say that view of yours is not a Quranic worldview. It is a worldview that is contrary to God's consideration and God's positing His favor upon humanity. And there are many examples in the Quran that God actually makes things multiply as a result of the favor and the blessings that He has bestowed upon the world. Also, we have to teach ourselves, or we have to impart that to say the truth even when it's against our own self. قُلِ الْحَقِّ وَلَوْ عَلَى نَفْسِكَ. We tend to actually often speak of truth when it is on our side or toward favor, and then we weasel around away from the truth when it is actually shows us or have a benefit or it's against some of our own interests. So we have to actually be truth tellers across. And that's why the highest form of struggle is a statement of truth in front of an oppressed tyrant. That's who we are. We're truth tellers. And also in our society respects dissenters. So you have to actually acquaint yourself with dissenting and don't go with in essence where the group is, because group tends to reinforce often the biases. This is not to contradict that yadullahi ma'al jama'ah, that you need to have the group, but to have what you call a healthy skepticism when the group is actually going in the wrong direction. So don't feel bad that sometimes you have to be the odd person out to say this is wrong. And that's actually the biggest challenge in group dynamics. And we know the whole issue of peer pressure and how peer pressure tends to actually produce often negative consequences. Lastly is to think about from a Quranic perspective that we believe it's again that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ennobled all of the human beings. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. So we do have to have a basic understanding that every human being is an ennobled human being. Their sins or wrong actions, they would be taken into account, but the dignity of the human being is a constitutive dignity from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and need to be firm in how we actually relate to individuals from our community and those outside of our community. And in this, just let me reference the following. I don't like to use the term non-Muslim because again, in here that defining the identity of a person as being none or a negation, rather than say, because the Quran says there are people of the book, there's Muslims and so on, so actually identify them by their particular categorization, Jews, Christians, atheists and so on, so actually identify them as such. So we often fail to recognize that actually to call people by the specific identity that they have relative to their religious practice is an important way to actually consider. It does not mean that you agree with them, but it's just that is the term that is applied to them, and that's how you should actually refer to them in such references. We have to be engaged in community building in order to counter the rising tide of populism. The Prophet ﷺ said, خَيْرُكُمْ خَيْرُكُمْ لِلنَّاسِ. Did not say خَيْرُكُمْ خَيْرُكُمْ لِلْمُسْلِمِينَ فَقط. Because again, the best of you is the best to all people, to all mankind. Right? So again, this has to be not to say that you're going to be the super inclusive person, but that's at the foundation that you are trying to be a benefit to humanity as a whole and to be engaged as such. And then lastly is that we have to be people that are firmly established on justice and to be witnesses to Allah, even against our own selves, our own parents, or those who are next of kin. This is the highest standard of justice in order for us to manifest. We cannot undo rising tide of right-wing populism by only just sniping across and just saying, well, they're doing this without actually retransforming and changing the order of civil society and be people of righteousness and consciousness based on our own Islamic understanding. And that, for me, is the foundation of how to counter right-wing populism. So I'm going to stop here, inshallah, but I encourage you to actually download our Islamophobia reporting app and also check our table for information, inshallah, before you leave. And I'll take your questions right now. Assalamu alaikum. Feel free to ask the questions. First in the back, go ahead.
Who is Samuel Huntington? Why he is so influential? Who is Samuel Huntington and why he is so influential?
Well, Samuel Huntington, why is Samuel Huntington is so influential and who he is? Well, Samuel Huntington is an academic. Interestingly enough, he was a Democrat, because we tend to think that he's a Republican. He wrote first his article after the end of the Cold War to conceptualize what are the new post-Cold War order. Then that book, that article, then was shifted into a full book. And the thesis itself originated from Bernard Lewis. And Bernard Lewis is an Orientalist that was critiqued heavily by Edward Said in terms of the Orientalist paradigm. The reason that his thesis became popular because it fitted the rise of right-wing populism in the United States, right-wing neoconservatism, and especially late 90s, post and immediately post 9/11, it became almost the Bible to explain the world in a very simplistic way, and also posit that we are in the good, pure, innocent victims for this rising tide that is taking place, whether it's the Muslim world or China. So that's how his thesis fit in, and then a whole bunch of think tanks adopted this worldview, and post 9/11, his writing and his book became a must-read for many of the establishment in the Pentagon and foreign policy circles in the United States and Europe. His work, Bernard Lewis' work, Fuad Ajami's work, Raphael Patai, The Arab Mind, became also another book that was being used and cited. All of these are highly, highly problematic works. They are very simplistic in terms of the construction of the problem, and they repackage Orientalist ideas and notions and project who's the next threat to Western civilization. So that's what you're seeing, why it became so popular, because, again, the think tanks that adopted it, and then policy circles that found it convenient to explain the work because it rationalized intervention. We're intervening not because we're intervening to take oil or to reshape resources and trade, we're intervening to prevent you from hurting us in the future. So it actually rationalizes preemptive intervention.
The Muslims that have come to the United States look down upon black people. If you ask them, they'll say that they don't.
Yeah.
But they step on our face just like every other immigrant that comes to America. Step on our face to get where they're going. The number one liquor store owners in our community are Muslims. Okay? So we've been suffering for all this time. Then when we come to Islam, we still don't get justice. The Muslims talk about social justice. We come to the masjid. Look how many of us are here. A few. And I'm an outsider. No love. Pray together, but that's about it. The treatment I get from the immigrant Muslims is not much better than the treatment from white people. The difference is with white people, they're honest, so I know where they're coming from. That's why when black people in America, they fare much better in the South than they do in the North. Because in the South, they knew where the whites were coming from, so Atlanta, Georgia, Houston, Texas, Charlotte, North Carolina, blacks lived much better. Most of the lynching took place after the original lynching that took place in the South. Then it started happening in Detroit, Chicago, and LA, which is now the prison industrial complex. The Muslims, we come to these communities and we're hoping that we're going to find brotherhood, and we find hypocrisy.
So Muslims, in terms of immigrant Muslims, do they have a racial problem and racial worldview? Absolutely. many parts, again, the map I showed you, much of the Muslim world and much of the southern hemisphere has been a colonial enterprise. Colonial enterprise was structured around the elevation of whiteness and white superiority. That has been internalized by Muslims and other colonized subjects. So when they arrive in America, I'm sorry to say, they are not looking at linking up with the African American community because it reminds them of the inferiority that they have relative to whiteness. And if we think about the history and the challenges, is that among racial minorities, violence and rejection of each other tend to be far more intense than vertical, actually, violence and rejection, because you are actually aspiring to move up. So you want to actually have the white picket fence, and you want to do, in essence, affiliate and associate with whiteness because that's the superior. So I'm not surprised, again, that immigrant Muslims exhibit those tendencies, and they tend to actually align themselves with parts of the American society that does not have their best interest. And I challenge, again, Muslims on a regular basis that when we think of, let's say, interfaith dialogue, we are not dialoguing, let's say, interfaith with African American churches. Interfaith in the Muslim conceptualization is to actually find a white church because we assume that they're going to be gatekeepers and open for us access and opportunity upwardly mobile. While interfaith with the African Americans, churches, almost not even second tier, not even third tier or fourth tier. On the other hand, interfaith among Muslims in terms of various communities is almost non-existent. And that's why for this year, for the Northern California Islamic Council, one of my agendas is to create an interfaith committee that begins to actually relate and deal with Muslims to relate to one another so we could actually build a community to challenge these contradictions. So it's not surprising that you have, again, in Oakland, large numbers of liquor stores, or San Francisco, where the owners of these stores are Muslims. Now, you could critique the liquor industry, from here to Judgment Day, and we could critique it. The fact that the city gives 4 permits for a liquor store in each corner in the inner city, while the same permits are not given in the more affluent, that's a city politics that we need to critique because they're getting some type of benefit. But for a Muslim to take that liquor store and then in some of the shelves to say, Hatem Fadlu Rabbi, that for me is like an insanity relative to the Muslim. So those are the contradictions that we need to resolve, but one has to understand where the genealogy comes from in order for us to begin to challenge it.
I do,
Can I take another question?
One more thing I wanted to say.
No, but
I agree with you. I just wanted to say something about the Africans.
I know, but
because I didn't want you to think that I was saying about because the Africans, we have the same relationship.
No, I know the double consciousness with W. Du Bois and so on. So again, the genealogy of the problem has to be understood in order for us to resolve it and to begin to challenge it. Somebody was. Go ahead.
I was going to make a comment.
Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. And I was going to say, the first thing that comes to my mind is like what action can we take? And I know that just wanted to kind of let the audience know there's groups of Muslims gathering together to get Muslim folks in politics and things like that. A lot of us are coming around behind Bernie Sanders, so folks are interested, to kind of like make a difference or try to take some action on this. There is a group of us Muslims kind of try to take that action. You can come talk to me after or look up our page on Bay Area Muslims for Bernie, Facebook, or and from there we'll have other resources for ways to get involved.
Bernie is coming to town this weekend, right?
Yeah, he's actually meeting with a group of Muslim leaders. Bernie Sanders, presidential candidate. He's the only presidential candidate that's given Muslims, any time of day. His campaign manager is actually Muslim. By shocking. So, there's a lot of us coming behind him, but there's other candidates too. It's not about the candidates; it's about a community taking action. So, if folks are interested in that, come talk to me, or again, look up Bay Area Muslims for Bernie, Instagram, Facebook.
Another question?
You had a question. You said you wanted to ask me a question earlier.
I'll do it privately,
You do it privately?
if you don't mind.
I was going to charge you because we're auctioning one question at a time. No, it was organically developed movement.
By lesbians.
Huh?
By lesbians.
Well, again, it's organically started movement in order to deal with, especially around Trayvon Martin's killing and shooting. Now, did many forces come into it? Yes, but we should not confuse the principle behind stating Black Lives Matter versus the various constituents. And I think Muslims tend to have what you call a purity of lens, that either people have to fulfill all of what you call Sharia criteria, or that we don't actually engage. I tend to believe that we have to be principled in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, because every time that a black person is being shot, that for us is one human being that is a brother and sister to us from the human family. Right? And the fact that someone happened to be outside of the Muslim community expressing solidarity on the same voice, for me that's not a problem, and I could deal with those contradictions. On a weekly basis, 2 African Americans get shot in this country. If you think about it, the number of African Americans being shot by police still something that is completely unaddressed, and often these individuals are not armed. How often do you hear a white person driving a car and ends up dead because of a broken tail light? Or being stopped and ending being shot? Or being taken to a jail, which by the time, if the handcuffs were placed on you and you're driven by a police car, now you are in the custody of the state. There shouldn't be any reason for a person that is taken by a police car, put in the jail, for them to die in that jail. That becomes the responsibility of the state. And I don't care what your color is, but it's mostly African Americans that end up dying in jail as a result of that process. And I think it's a shame on our society that we continue today in the 2019, that we continue to see these cases almost on a daily basis. That for me, it's not who's part or not part of the Black Lives Matter. It's Black lives don't matter in this country, and every day on the news we see that they are not, they don't matter because the responsibilities of those who uphold the political orders and the justice system are not really adhering. If it was in Moraga and you have 2 people get shot every day, I would say they would fly maybe a 747 psychologists and psychiatrists to see what the problem is. And for me, that's the issue. And what's more insidious is also how civil society deal with it. I always say that the police that shoots an African American, that's one bullet. But the journalists and the media that begins to write about it and problematize the victim, that for me is another level that we need to challenge, because they kill every African American in the society's consciousness and begin to look at their history, whether they were arrested at age 4 or 5 or 6. They begin to look at their parents and so on. While another person that gets shot, we begin to actually sympathize with them. We begin to say whether they played soccer or football, which high school they graduated. We begin to see pictures of their friends rather than the mugshot that actually is often being placed in there. So there's a heavy irresponsibility that the journalists and the media should be taking into account of how the structural demonization that occurs on a daily basis. And I think we should be individuals that speak loudly about and not apologize at all. I think the state and the police forces should apologize for us collectively that they're using our trust in the institution to actually kill people almost without any single person being taken into account. Okay, thank you for listening. Jazakumullah khair. I promise not to go till suhoor, so you are released right now. Assalamu alaikum.